and welcome. This is Жанна Бугибаевна, a teacher of English at Kazakh University of Technology and Business. Today's theme is sequence of tenses. Before we start, let's talk about the objectives of this lesson. So by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to define sequence of tenses, state the rules for sequence of tenses, and make sentences using the correct sequence of tenses. Before we start talking about sequence of tenses, let's revise the big types of sentences. They are compound and complex sentences. So compound sentences, these are the sentences that have two independent clauses, usually joined by a conjunction. For example, he did not cheat in the game because it was the wrong thing to do. So here, he did not cheat in the game is an independent clause. And the second independent clause is it was the wrong thing to do. So it means here we have separate two sentences, but it is joined by the conjunction because. So second example, mother really wants to go to the market, but she feels too tired. Also, in this sentence, we have two separate sentences. First is in red, mother really wants to go to the market. And the second is she feels too tired. Also, here, two sentences linked by a conjunction but. So second type of sentence is complex sentences. These are the sentences that have one independent or main clause and one or more dependent or subordinate clauses. So for example, I prefer to read books that are best sellers. In this sentence, in red, I prefer to read books. Here is an independent clause in a sentence. And that are bestsellers, this is a subordinate clause. So let's have a look at the second example. I love people who are friendly. In red, I love people, it's a main clause. It is a complete sentence. And the second clause is independent or subordinate clause, who are friendly, because it cannot stand by its own. For example, example 3, she gives good counsel to her siblings and friends. She gives good counsel is a main clause, and to her siblings and friends, it's subordinate clause. It cannot stand by its own, and it depends on the first clause, the main clause, to have the meaning. So this is the foundation or basis upon which we build and knowledge of sequence of tenses, because in these sentences with main clauses and subordinate clauses, we find that we have different verbs or we have more than one verb, or sequence of tenses simply has to do with the wave of verbs changing in tenses. So let's define what a sequence of tenses is. Tenses of verbs often change as we express ourselves in these sentences. And in this case of complex sentences, where there are two or more clauses, the tense of the verbs in the subordinate clause changes depending on the tense of the verb in the main clause. Due to the change in these tenses, we have a process called sequence of tenses occurring. Sequence of tenses refers to the way verbs in a particular sentence change their tenses. So the tenses can be in the future tense, simple tense, perfect tense, and the action will also take place in the future, for example, as we have different tenses: present tense, past tense, future tense, and so on and so forth. So, once again, in a sentence, you can have more than one verb. And as a rule, or there are rules governing the way those verbs change their tenses. This is called sequence of tenses. When the verbs follow the rules, what happens or what would have happened is a process known as sequence of tenses. So now, let's have a look at some rules which govern the way verbs change their tension in these sentences, rules governing the sequence of tenses. The first rule states that when the verb in the main clause is in past or past perfect tense, the verb in the subordinate clause is usually in past tense. So, for example, I found out that he was upset after dinner last night. This is a complex sentence. Do you remember? Complex sentence has a main clause and one or more dependent clauses. So here, the main clause says that he was upset after dinner last night. This is the main clause. Independent clause, that means this is a separate sentence of this sentence. So the subordinate clause is I found out. This is a dependent clause that it depends to the main clause to make the meaning of a sentence. So as a rule here, if the verb in the main clause is in the past, also, for example, here was, also in the subordinate clause, the verb should be in the past tense. Clear? So turn the second example. She practiced so hard that she got the award. The main clause in this sentence is she got the award, because it can stand on its own and it is not depends on the first clause. So the subordinate clause in this sentence is she practiced so hard that. So it's not complete sentence and it depends on the main clause to the she got the word to have the full meaning. So as a rule here, if the main clause is in the past tense, here's the got. And also, the subordinate clause is usually in the past tense, practiced. Number 3, he earned so much money that he became the richest. Here, the independent clause is he earned so much money, and the subordinate clause is that he became the richest. So following the rule, number 1, the verb in the main clause is in the past. That is why the verb in the subordinate clause is also in the past tense. So there is an exception to the rule 1. The verb in the subordinate clause can be in present tense, even when the verb in the main clause is in the past tense, when a subordinate clause expresses a universal idea or truth. So the universal idea or truth, it means that that we believe, yeah, to the rules, and it cannot be changed, yeah, by economic change, and they are believed by people, by all the people in the world. For example, the teacher said that patience is a virtue. In this sentence, here we have present tense and the past tense. So this is an exception for the rule 1. And we cannot say that the teacher said that patience was a virtue. So it's a truth, yeah, everybody knows. That is why here the exception to the rule. Second example, we learned that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So everybody knows, all the people in the world knows that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. It's a truth, yeah, and we cannot say we learned that the sun rose in the east and set in the west. This should be incorrect sentence. We cannot say like this. So rule number 2 states that if the verb in the main clause is in the past, the verb in the subordinate clause can be in any tense if it is introduced by the word than. So for example, she taught English language better than she teaches literature in English. So we told that the verb in the subordinate clause can be in any tense, whether present tense or past tense or future tense, as long as it is followed by, as long as it is introduced by the word done. In this sentence, we have the main clause, she taught English language better, and the subordinate clause, then she teaches literature in English. Now here in the main clause, we have the verb taught, and the taught is in the past tense. So remember the rule number 2 says if the verb in the main clause is in the past tense, it can be in any tense, yeah, as long as it is introduced by the word than. So this is a subordinate clause, teachers, and this is in the present tense. So we have she taught English language better than she teaches literature in English. So here the verb in the subordinate clause is in the present tense. Now if you look at the second example, still using the same sentence, we have she taught English language better than she taught literature in English. Here the verb in the subordinate clause is it is past tense. And for last example, she taught English language better than she will teach literature in English. Here we find that the verb in the subordinate clause is in its future tense. So we finally rule number 2 applying in these sentences, and the rule states that where you have the verb in the main clause in the past tense, the verbs in the subordinate clause can be in any tense at all. So in number 1, we have teachers in present tense, we have taught in past tense, we have will teach in future tense. They all have the verb in the main clause in past tense, and this was possible because the subordinate clause is introduced by the word than. So, if we don't have the word than in these sentences, so we'll go back to the first rule. Rule number 3 states that when the verb in the main clause in the present or future tense, the verb in subordinate clause can be in any tense, past, present, or future tense. So for example, Chris says that she won the race. Chris says that she will win the race. Chris says that she wins the race. So the main clause in these sentences is Chris says, and subordinate clause that she won the race. So in the main clause, the verb says in a present tense, and in a subordinate clause it is in the past. In the second sentence, the verb in main clause is also present simple, present tense, and the second subordinate clause, it is in the future tense. So we can use past, present, or future tense, yeah, in a subordinate clause when the main clause is in the present or future tense. So here we'll look at the verbs that in this main clause in present tense. Now let's look at the situation. Turning to the next slide. So rule number 4 states that when the verb in the main clause is in present perfect or past perfect tense, the verb in subordinate clause should be in past tense. So for example, she has been sick since she got back home. So in this sentence, she has been sick, it is a main clause, and subordinate clause is since she got back home. So as the rule states that the main clause could take, when they take the verb take present perfect or past perfect, and subordinate clause which should be in the past tense. Another example, the students had submitted their homework before the teacher arrived. So can you guess the main clause here? Yes, the students had submitted. Here is the main clause because it is in the past perfect. Their homework before the teacher arrived. This is a subordinate clause of this whole sentence. So rule number 5 says, when the verb is in the main clause is in the future perfect tense, the verb in subordinate clause should be in present tense or present perfect tense. For example, most ladies will have been married by the time they graduate from school. So here the main clause is most ladies will have been married, and by the time they graduate from school, it's a subordinate clause. So to sum up today's lesson on beginning from introduction to sequence of tenses. Sequence of tenses refers to the way verbs in a particular sentence change their tenses. So you defined what is a sequence of tenses, and in complex sentences, verbs in subordinate clause change their tenses depending on the tense of the verb in the main clause. Certain rules govern the way verbs change their tenses in sentences. So I think you have learned a lot from this lesson. Thank you for your attention. See you next week.